Pay attention to this security camera footage. You're looking at the main hallway of a middle school, and there's a teenager walking through it. Look at what he's wearing. That distinctive cow print hoodie, the bright red sneakers, the baseball cap. But now look at what he's carrying. That's right, an assault rifle. He's holding it casually, almost like it's a prop in a movie. Watch his body language. There's no panic, no hesitation. He's walking with purpose. And in just a few seconds, he's going to turn this ordinary Tuesday morning into something that would leave investigators questioning everything they thought they knew about online manipulation, teenage psychology, and the terrifying intersection of social media and violence. Because what happened next at Riverside Middle School wasn't just a crime, it was a performance. And 4 people were about to pay the price. You know that moment when you're scrolling through social media and you see something that makes you stop, makes you think, that can't be real? For the students and staff of Riverside Middle School in Portland, Oregon, that moment became their worst nightmare on March 15, 2018. Riverside was the kind of school you'd find in any American suburb. About 600 students, decent test scores, a basketball team that made it to regionals once. Nothing special, nothing terrible, just normal. The kind of place where the biggest drama was usually who was dating who or which teacher gave the hardest tests. 15-year-old Cameron Walsh was what you'd call an odd kid, but not in a way that raised red flags. He was into art, spent most of his time online, wore these quirky outfits that made him stand out, especially that cow print hoodie he'd ordered from some obscure streetwear site. His teachers described him as quiet but creative. His classmates? They barely knew he existed. Cameron lived in that invisible space that so many teenagers occupy. Not popular enough to be noticed, not troubled enough to be worried about. His mom, Linda Walsh, worked double shifts as a nurse at the local hospital. His dad had left when Cameron was 7, sending birthday cards twice a year like that somehow made up for being absent. Linda did her best. She really did. But working 60-hour weeks meant she didn't see the change happening in her son. Didn't notice how much time he spent in his room with the door locked. Didn't know about the Discord servers he'd joined, or the encrypted messages lighting up his phone at 3 in the morning. Cameron had found something online, or maybe it had found him. Either way, by March of 2018, he'd been pulled into something that would turn an ordinary Wednesday morning into a case that still haunts investigators today. March 15th started like any other day at Riverside Middle School. Kids shuffled through the doors, complaining about homework they hadn't finished, talking about some TV show everyone was watching. The morning bell was still 10 minutes away. Teachers were in the lounge getting their second or third cup of coffee. The security guard, Marcus Thompson, was doing his usual rounds. Cameron Walsh walked through the front entrance at 7:47 a.m. He was wearing that cow print hoodie, bright blue jeans, and these impossibly red sneakers that looked like they glowed. In his hands was what appeared to be an AK-47 assault rifle. You'd think someone would have stopped him right there, right? But here's the thing about the human brain. Sometimes when we see something so outrageous, so beyond what we expect, we don't immediately process it as real. A few students saw him and laughed, thinking it was a prop for some project. One teacher, Mrs. Henderson, actually told him he needed to take that to the office because realistic toy guns aren't allowed on campus. Cameron didn't respond. He just kept walking down the main hallway. And that's when the security cameras captured him in that chilling footage that would later be played in courtrooms and featured in news broadcasts across the country. At 7:49 a.m., Cameron stopped in the middle of the East Wing corridor. Students were still filtering in, lockers were banging open and shut, and that's when he shouted at the top of his lungs, "This is for the algorithm!" What happened next sent the school into absolute chaos. 3 students near their lockers, 13-year-old Sophie Martinez, 12-year-old Ryan Chen, and 14-year-old Aisha Johnson, suddenly collapsed. Blood was spreading across their clothes. Down the hall, guidance counselor Patricia Morgan grabbed her shoulder and fell against the wall, screaming. The blood was everywhere. Students started running, screaming. Teachers were pulling kids into classrooms, slamming doors, pushing filing cabinets against them. Cameron kept moving through the hallway, and this is where it gets even more disturbing. He was holding his phone in his other hand, live streaming everything. Every few seconds, he'd pause and shout these bizarre phrases. "Reality is the ultimate content. You're all extras in my production. Watch the shares climb." The school resource officer, Deputy James Crawford, was in the parking lot when he heard the screams. He radioed for backup and ran toward the building, his training kicking in even as his hands shook. Active shooter, multiple victims, suspects still mobile and armed. Within 4 minutes, the first police units were on scene. Within 7 minutes, the school was surrounded. SWAT teams were mobilizing. Helicopter news crews were already lifting off. Parents who heard the alerts on their phones were flooding the streets around the school, desperate to know if their children were alive. Inside, Cameron had barricaded himself in the computer lab. The live stream was still running. 47 people were watching online, seeing shaky footage of overturned desks and Cameron's heavy breathing as he muttered to himself. The director said it would be perfect. He said they'd understand. Art. Real art. Let me paint you a picture of what was happening in those classrooms. 6th grader Emma Rodrigo was hiding in a supply closet with her English teacher, texting her mom, "I love you," over and over. 12-year-old Marcus Webb was using his belt as a tourniquet on a friend's arm. Teachers were keeping kids quiet, phones silenced, lights off, following the active shooter protocols they'd practiced but never thought they'd actually use. The 4 victims were in critical condition. Sophie Martinez had been hit in the abdomen, the metal projectile tearing through soft tissue. Ryan Chen took one to the leg, missing his femoral artery by less than an inch. Aisha Johnson was bleeding from her arm, in shock, unable to speak. Patricia Morgan, the guidance counselor who'd worked at Riverside for 15 years, was hit in the shoulder and was losing blood fast. But here's what made it even more horrific, and what investigators wouldn't discover for another 3 hours. Cameron had never actually pulled a trigger. The rifle was fake, a 3D printed replica that looked absolutely real but couldn't fire a single round. So where did the blood come from? Where were those metal projectiles that were now lodged in 4 people's bodies? Cameron had spent weeks setting up pneumatic devices in the hallway, hidden behind ceiling tiles tucked into corners, small compressed air launchers that he'd triggered remotely using a modified phone app. The projectiles? Ball bearings that he'd meticulously coated in a mixture of red paint and his own blood, which he'd been collecting for weeks by pricking his finger and storing it in vials in his mini-fridge. The blood was real. The weapons were hidden. The entire thing was staged. At 8:23 a.m., the SWAT team breached the computer lab. Cameron was sitting on the floor, the fake rifle beside him, his phone still streaming. He looked up at the officers with these empty eyes and said, "Did we get enough views?" The director said we needed at least 10,000. They tackled him, cuffed him, and dragged him out while he kept asking about view counts and engagement metrics. The live stream cut off. The 47 viewers sat in stunned silence as their screens went black. Outside, ambulances were rushing the 4 victims to Portland General Hospital. Sophie Martinez was already in surgery. Ryan Chen was stable but traumatized. Aisha Johnson wouldn't speak for 3 days. Patricia Morgan would survive, but would never return to teaching. And as parents were finally being reunited with their terrified children, as news crews broadcast footage of students streaming out of the building with their hands raised, investigators were beginning to realize this wasn't just a school shooting. This was something else entirely. Something that would lead them down a rabbit hole of online manipulation, teenage vulnerability, and a mastermind who called himself the Director. Here's the thing about teenagers and phones. They document everything, and Cameron Walsh was no exception. Detective Sarah Chen from the Portland Police Department's Major Crimes Unit caught the case. She'd worked dozens of violent crimes, but this one felt different from the moment she arrived at the scene. The staged nature of it, the performance aspect, the live stream. Something about it nagged at her. When they searched Cameron's bedroom later that day, what they found was disturbing in a completely unexpected way. His computer had multiple monitors, professional streaming equipment, ring lights, and a whiteboard covered in what looked like shot lists and storyboards. This wasn't the room of a school shooter. This was the room of a content creator. Cameron's phone was the key to everything. Once the tech team cracked it, they found months of communication on encrypted messaging apps, And that's when they discovered the director. The messages went back 7 months. It started innocently enough. Cameron had joined a Discord server dedicated to experimental film and performance art. The director was the admin, and he recruited slowly, carefully, identifying teenagers who seemed creative, isolated, desperate to be part of something bigger than themselves. "You're not like the others," the director had written to Cameron in August. "You see through the facade. You understand that reality is just a construct waiting to be deconstructed." Over the next few months, the director slowly introduced Cameron to what he called immersive reality experiences. The goal, he explained, was to create living art installations that would expose society's desensitization to violence, that would make people feel something real in an age of endless scrolling and fake news. But here's what made it even more twisted. Cameron wasn't the only one. As Detective Chen dug deeper into the Discord server, she found 6 other teenagers, different states, different schools, all of them talking to the director, all of them planning what they called productions. 17-year-old Miguel Santos in Phoenix had been instructed to stage a bank robbery experience using props and actors he thought were part of the collective. 16-year-old Jessica Kim in Chicago was planning a kidnapping narrative in a public park. 15-year-old Tyler Brooks in Miami was working on a hostage situation at a movie theater. None of them had been executed yet. Cameron was the first. The director had groomed these kids slowly, convincing them they were artists, revolutionaries, that they were creating something meaningful. He used their isolation, their desire to be seen, their teenage belief that they understood the world better than adults did. He mixed in just enough legitimate art theory, references to performance artists like Marina Abramovich, discussions of reality versus perception, quotes from postmodern philosophers, to make it all seem intellectual and important. Cameron genuinely believed he was part of an art collective. He thought the injuries were accidents, that the pneumatic devices were supposed to shoot props, not hurt people. At least, that's what he told detectives during his interrogation. Whether that was true or a convenient excuse would be debated for months. "The director told me it was all theater," Cameron said, tears streaming down his face in the interrogation room. "He said everyone would be in on it. He said it was supposed to expose how quickly people believe what they see online. I didn't know anyone would actually get hurt. I swear I didn't know." Detective Chen watched the video feed from the observation room, trying to read this kid. Was he a victim or a perpetrator? Maybe both? But the question that haunted everyone was, who was the director? The communication was always through voice modulators. The payments for equipment and supplies came through cryptocurrency that bounced through multiple wallets. The IP addresses were masked through VPNs and Tor browsers. This person knew how to stay hidden. Then came the breakthrough that changed everything. A junior analyst named Kevin Park in the FBI's cybercrimes unit noticed something in the blockchain records. The director had gotten sloppy once, just once, back in November when he'd sent Cameron $200 for equipment. The cryptocurrency exchange had required identity verification, and whoever set up that account had used their real information, probably thinking the layers of anonymity would be enough. They traced it to a digital wallet owned by someone named Damien Fischer, 22 years old, last known address in Los Angeles. When Detective Chen pulled up Damien's background, the pieces started falling into place in the most disturbing way possible. Damien Fischer had been a child actor. You might have seen him if you were watching TV in the early 2000s. He played the quirky best friend on a Disney Channel show called Campus Crew that ran for 3 seasons. He was 13 when it started, 16 when it was canceled. The show had decent ratings, nothing spectacular, but Damien had been convinced he was going to be famous. When the show ended, so did his career. No callbacks, no auditions, nothing. His Instagram following, which had peaked at 200,000, slowly dwindled as people forgot who he was. By age 19, he was working at a Starbucks in Van Nuys, serving lattes to people who used to recognize him but couldn't quite remember from where. According to his former therapist, who spoke to investigators after Damien waived his privacy rights in a bizarre attempt to explain himself, Damien had experienced what she called a severe identity crisis coupled with delusions of grandeur. When he couldn't be famous through traditional means, he decided to become famous through chaos. He told me once that if he couldn't make people love him, he'd make them remember him, the therapist said. He was obsessed with viral moments, with things that break through the noise. He said art was dead and only spectacle mattered now. The FBI tracked Damien to an apartment in downtown Los Angeles. When they kicked in the door on March 23rd, 8 days after Cameron's attack, they found him at his computer, communicating with Tyler Brooks in Miami, giving him final instructions for his production that was scheduled for the following week. The apartment was covered in news clippings about Cameron's attack. Every channel, every angle, every think piece about social media and teenage violence. Damien had printed them out and taped them to his walls like trophies. In the center of his desk was a notebook filled with plans for future installations. Schools in Nevada, a shopping mall in Texas, a college campus in Florida. When the agents arrested him, you know what he said? "How many views did Cameron get? Did we trend?" The investigation into Damien Fischer revealed something that made everyone involved feel sick. This wasn't impulsive. This wasn't a mental breakdown. This was calculated, methodical, and deeply disturbed. Damien's computer contained thousands of messages, detailed plans, psychological profiles he'd created on each of the teenagers he'd recruited. He'd studied manipulation techniques, read books on cult psychology, researched how terrorist organizations radicalized young people online. He'd taken all of that and weaponized it for what he called maximum cultural impact. In his journal, yes, he kept a physical journal because of course he did, Damien wrote about his philosophy. "Traditional art is invisible," one entry read. "It hangs in museums where nobody goes. It plays in theaters to empty seats. But create something that forces itself into people's lives, something they can't look away from, and suddenly you're immortal. Picasso is dead, but Columbine is forever." Let me tell you what chilled investigators to the bone. Damien had been planning this for 3 years. He'd spent months on different Discord servers, Reddit threads, Instagram comment sections, identifying vulnerable teenagers, kids who posted about feeling invisible, kids who talked about wanting to do something meaningful, kids who felt like society had left them behind. He'd approach them slowly, never pushy, always understanding. "I get it," his messages would start. "Everyone's so fake. Everyone's just performing for likes. But what if we created something real?" The other 6 teenagers he'd recruited were arrested before they could carry out their plans. Miguel Santos in Phoenix had already purchased a pellet gun painted to look real. Jessica Kim in Chicago had scoped out 3 different parks. Tyler Brooks in Miami had written a manifesto that echoed everything Damien had fed him about the death of authenticity. All of them told similar stories. They thought they were artists. They thought they were part of something important. They thought the director saw something special in them. But let's go back to that security footage from Riverside Middle School. Remember those cameras that caught Cameron walking through the hallway? That became a crucial piece of evidence in ways nobody expected. Detective Chen spent hours analyzing every frame of that footage, and she noticed something. At 7:48 a.m., 30 seconds before Cameron started shouting, there's a brief moment where he pulls out his phone and looks at it. The tech team enhanced the image, and you can see he's reading a message. The timestamp matched exactly with a message from the director found on his phone later. "Remember, this is your moment. Make it count. The world is watching." That message became evidence of Damien's direct involvement in inciting the attack. It showed premeditation, coordination, and intent. It transformed the case from just charging Cameron to building a conspiracy case against Damien that could put him away for decades. But the evidence that really sealed it was the live stream footage itself. The 47 people who'd been watching Cameron's stream, investigators tracked down every single one of them. Most were other teenagers in the director's network, but 3 of them were burner accounts that belonged to Damien himself. He'd been watching his production in real time from 3 different angles, recording everything for his archive. The FBI recovered Damien's hard drives, multiple terabytes of data, videos of every conversation with his recruits, screen recordings of the planning sessions, and most damning of all, a folder labeled Premiere that contained edited footage from Cameron's attack, complete with music, title cards, and effects. Damien had been planning to release it as his debut film. He thought he was Banksy, one FBI agent told the press. He thought he was creating revolutionary art. Instead, he'd created a trauma machine that hurt real people for his ego. The case against Cameron was complicated. His lawyers argued he'd been groomed, manipulated by someone older and more sophisticated. The prosecution argued he knew what he was doing, that he'd built those pneumatic devices himself, collected his own blood, caused real harm to 4 people who'd never done anything to him. The families of the victims had to relive everything during the hearings. Sophie Martinez's parents described how their 13-year-old daughter now had panic attacks in crowded places. Ryan Chen's mom talked about the physical therapy, the nightmares, the way her son flinched at loud noises. Aisha Johnson's family had moved to a different state, unable to stay in Portland after what happened. And Patricia Morgan, the guidance counselor, sat in the courtroom with her arm still in a sling, facing the kid she'd tried to help so many times when he seemed lost. "I knew Cameron was struggling," Patricia testified. "I offered to talk with him multiple times. He always said he was fine. How do you help someone who won't let you in?" The trial exposed the dark side of social media in ways that made national headlines. Experts testified about online radicalization, parasocial relationships, the dopamine-driven need for validation through views and likes. Parents across the country started looking more carefully at what their teenagers were doing online, who they were talking to, what communities they'd joined. Damien Fischer's trial was even more disturbing. He showed no remorse. During his testimony, he actually seemed proud of what he'd orchestrated. He talked about it in artistic terms, using pretentious language about deconstructing the barrier between observer and participant, and forcing society to confront its own complicity in violence. The jury saw right through it. So did the judge. The verdicts came down in November of 2018. Cameron Walsh was tried as a juvenile due to his age and the evidence of manipulation. He was convicted on 4 counts of aggravated assault, reckless endangerment, and inducing panic. The judge sentenced him to 12 years in juvenile detention with the possibility of transfer to adult prison if he failed to show rehabilitation. He'd also have to complete extensive psychiatric treatment and would be on probation for years after his release. Damien Fischer faced a different fate entirely. He was convicted on 4 counts of conspiracy to commit assault, 4 counts of second-degree assault, inciting violence, exploitation of a minor, and criminal use of electronic communication to facilitate a crime. The jury deliberated for less than 6 hours. He was sentenced to 35 years in federal prison, without the possibility of parole for the first 20 years. The other 6 teenagers in the director's network faced various charges depending on how far their plans had progressed, but all received lesser sentences with requirements for extensive counseling and monitoring. The 4 victims had long roads to recovery. Sophie Martinez had 3 surgeries to repair internal damage. Ryan Chen walks with a slight limp that doctors say might never fully go away. Aisha Johnson struggled with PTSD for years and eventually became an advocate for mental health resources in schools. Patricia Morgan retired from education and moved to Oregon's coast, where she volunteers at an animal shelter and is trying to find peace. Linda Walsh, Cameron's mother, sold their house and moved to Montana. She visits her son in detention once a month, still trying to understand how the quiet kid, who used to draw comics in his notebook, became someone capable of hurting people. She started a nonprofit focused on educating parents about online radicalization and the warning signs of manipulation. Riverside Middle School installed upgraded security systems, added more counselors, and created programs focused on helping students feel connected and seen. Because that's what the director had exploited, that desperate teenage need to be part of something, to matter, to be noticed. The case sparked national conversations about social media platforms' responsibilities, about the psychological impact of constant content consumption, about how easily vulnerable young people can be manipulated by sophisticated predators hiding behind screens. But beyond all the policy debates and security upgrades and conversations about technology, There are 4 people who carry scars from March 15th, 2018. 4 people whose lives were forever changed because a troubled teenager wanted to be seen and a failed actor wanted to be remembered. Sophie Martinez, Ryan Chen, Aisha Johnson, and Patricia Morgan deserved better than to become unwilling performers in someone else's twisted production. They deserve to live their lives without trauma, without scars, without nightmares about a kid in a cow print hoodie walking down their school hallway with what looked like a rifle. They survived, but survival isn't the same as being whole again. And as we close this case, we remember them not as victims, but as people who endured something no one should have to endure, who faced something unimaginable, and who found ways to keep living despite everything. May they find peace, may they heal, may they never be forgotten.